Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back. Today, we're going to take a look at Canada. I know when things begin to settle down with COVID, we've kind of saturated the US market, and it's time to be looking north to our friends up there and thinking about expanding our operations in the Canadian market. And we've got two terrific speakers for you now to share with you everything you need to know about successfully expanding into the Canadian market. Joining us today, Mr. Larry Weinberg, chair of the franchise law group of the Cassels law firm. Larry has extensive experience advising corporate and franchise clients in the restaurant and hospitality industries. He focuses on all forms of franchising, licensing, trademarks, and providing all necessary legal services around these topics. Please welcome Larry Weinberg. Joining Larry today is Mr. Frank Robinson, the co-chair of the Hospitality Law Group at the Cassels law firm. Frank also advises Canadian and international companies on all matters relating to franchising, licensing, distribution, and IP. He also has extensive experience advising franchise clients in the restaurant and hospitality industries. Please welcome Frank Robinson. Well, let's crank it up. Take it away, Larry. It's a successful expansion to Canada.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Our goal today is to provide you with some reasons to come back at the end of the month and share with us a deeper dive on why and how you can successfully expand to the Canadian market. So we're going to do a brief overview of the content of our presentation. So starting with, Canada is still usually the first market where American brands look to expand. We call it international light. The reason for this is pretty obvious. There's all the things listed on our slide which show you why Canada is often the first place where American brands have looked to go for the last 50 or more years, including geographic proximity, similar standard of living and consumer tastes. We both speak the English language. We have a knowledge of and demand for US brands and a very similar legal and financial system. Frank, next slide.
Thanks. So the first thing to think about and consider is, how are you getting to Canada? What expansion model are you going to use? There are obviously many different financial, strategic, legal, and other considerations which might impact your choice. And once you've made that choice, it influences many different factors along the path and causes a chain reaction of other elections and decisions you need to make as you plan your Canadian expansion. In many cases, our clients approach this as a fork in the road, deciding to expand either by way of direct owned units or through franchising. But in some cases, clients do choose a hybrid model and use both forms of expansion. In most cases, I would say it's one or the other, and it allows the business to specialize and focus on one approach over the other. On the slide, you'll see a few different franchise models, each of which is worth its own detailed discussion, which is probably beyond the scope of today's presentation, but we can talk in a deeper dive. They range from one-off deals with franchisees to multi-unit and even sub-franchise relationships, and even brokered sales through area representation models. All of them have their pros and cons, of course, which we're happy to discuss in our paper and further when we meet later in the month. Next slide, Larry.
You know, I've been doing this for 30 years or more, and I've seen a lot of people do it right, and frankly, some people do it wrong. And I think one of the things to keep in mind is Canada and the US, while the most similar of two different countries in the world, there are still differences, and those differences should be appreciated. And when we've seen most success is when a franchisor can establish in some way boots on the ground. How they do that? Well, that can depend, because it can be anything from employees in the market to a sophisticated area developer or master franchisee. But we'll talk more about that later. Frank?
Thanks. So earlier I talked about how franchising and corporate expansion trigger different considerations. Well, corporate and tax planning are some of the primary threshold considerations for any expansion model, and the choice plays significantly into the options available. I'm often asked, what do most brands do? What do your clients do? And like any good lawyer, my answer is, well, it depends. Now, I say that obviously jokingly, But the truth is that the options are varied and it depends significantly on the status and arrangements of the brands as they exist when they plan their entrance into Canada. Things to keep in mind include currency issues, of course, the unit level revenues are going to be in Canadian dollars, withholding taxes, which apply to the license and royalty fees, and it means that a non-Canadian entity may not get 100 cents on the dollar that it would otherwise expect to be paid. They need to get money back and forth between the United States and Canada, and issues around the repatriation of funds. But of course, there are many more, and the point of this is really to get tax and corporate planning as an important initial step before you get into the Canadian expansion program. Next slide, Larry.
You're going to look at these slides on the screen and you're going to think we concocted them, but the reality is we didn't. These are what these brands have done to Canadianize some of their branding and things you should think about when coming into the Canadian market. It's as simple perhaps as adding a maple leaf or red maple leaf, but other things should be discussed as well. Frank.
Thank you. Next slide, leasing. So leasing dynamics in Canadian F&B landscape tend to be quite different than they are in the United States. And it's likely driven by a relative scarcity of prime real estate in the handful of major cities in the country, and likewise, concentration of real estate holdings in the hands of a smaller number of institutional commercial landlords. Of course, that changes when you get into the suburbs and the secondary markets, but it mostly holds true in the major markets. The result of that is, at least traditionally, that franchisors in Canada have tended to go on the head lease and sublet to their franchisees, since landlords are more insistent on having covenants from established players. This practice has moved slightly towards the model of franchisee on the lease as more US brands have come into the country, and I do suspect that we will continue to see that trend as we work our way out of the COVID situation, but it is a reality that exists still here in Canada. And as a result, franchisors and corporate chains alike need to take a more hands-on approach to their leasing and leasing arrangements, understanding the nuances in the Canadian market. For instance, although it's unusual in the United States, in Canada, it's not uncommon for franchisors and landlords to use binding letters of intent or offers to lease, which may not in fact be followed by a full form of lease. We actively represent many brands in Canada on their leasing matters, whether it's for their own sites or ultimately for their franchisees. Larry, on to the next slide.
When franchising, a lot of franchisors, especially in the US, will just turn over their plans and specs to the franchisees. But historically in Canada, franchisors in food and beverage have also used this as an opportunity to make a profit and have effectively offered turnkey units to franchisees by overseeing construction, hiring general contractors, and in essence, handing over the unit for a fee, a turnkey approach, and making money that way. We'll talk about that more later. Frank?
Thanks. For any brand that's particular about consistency, quality, and cost efficiency in regard to its ingredients and other inputs, and they all should be, getting the supply chain figured out at the outset should be one of the most important steps for any international expansion. And yet, more often than one would think, this is actually overlooked. In many cases, US brands do not account for the differences and challenges, often assuming that due to proximity, the Canadian supply chain can be an add-on to the US system. And while there are many broadline distributors that operate on both sides of the border, there's always complexity. For instance, poultry and dairy, key ingredients in many menu items, are often caught by tariffs, which make cross-border supply economically unfeasible. In most cases, this means finding local suppliers. And beyond local suppliers, brands need to think about local tastes, as the menu may need to be adapted to account for Canadian palates and sensitivities, not to mention the trend towards locally sourced ingredients. There's a lot to unpack here on this slide, and we'll be happy to dig deeper as we talk more about it later. Larry.
And of course, if you are franchising, then you have to worry about franchise law compliance in Canada. At the 10,000-foot level, Canadian franchise laws look exactly like those in the US. You have to give out an FDD and wait 14 days before collecting any money or signing any contract. But the devil's in the details, as they say, And there are significant differences once you get down into those details. So if you know all you need to know about US franchise law, you don't know all you need to know about Canadian franchise law. So we'll cover that in more detail later. Frank?
A few brief remarks on financing, as again, it's different up here in Canada. In Canada, there are only a handful of major banks with national exposure. There are, of course, smaller ones and credit unions, but the major banks do offer franchise finance programs with federally backed government loans like the SBL in the United States. In most cases, 25% of it's going to be personally guaranteed by the franchisee and the rest guaranteed by the federal government. These are broadly relied upon to help franchise and restaurant expansion in Canada. I should mention, we've experienced a whole new wave of government programs for small business, including restaurants, as a result of the COVID crisis, including wage subsidies, grants, loans that are only partially require repayment, lease programs, and others. Of course, many will argue that this hasn't been nearly enough, and in many cases that might be true, but it certainly has provided a needed lifeline as restaurants suffer through this down season with the added stress of COVID. That's enough for that slide. I think we got one more for you, Larry.
And employment laws. In Canada, employment laws are different than the United States, and we have to deal with that all the time. Canada generally might be seen as more European, employee friendly, but we've learned to live with that, and we do. So, but you need to know what the differences are. Thanks. Now to you, Stephen.
Gentlemen, that was fantastic. Thank you very much. Great insight. We're really looking forward to the deeper dive. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you on the next one.